Chapter 16, Friday, March 19th, 1779. Never before had such a sense of grief, loss, and despair touched the Shawnee nation. The hearts of her people were breaking, and there was a pain beyond description in the eyes of all of them. For so many years that it was difficult to remember exactly when they had started, the representatives of the 5 septs of the Shawnee tribe had been solemnly discussing what to do about the problem of the whites. At each such council it had become ever more clear that there would never be full agreement among them. Those who advocated peace and the adoption of the white man's ways were more than ever strongly convinced that this was the only means by which the Shawnee nation could survive. Those who advocated war were equally certain about living under such conditions would be life without honor, dignity, or respect, to which death was preferable. And now at last a decision had been reached. Beyond any doubt, it was the most important event that had ever occurred in the tribe. The Shawnee tribe split forever. There were no tears, but there was a grief of unbelievable depth among them all. There was not an individual among them leaving this land forever who was not leaving behind a member of his family or a friend, and not one of those staying was not bidding farewell for the last time to parents or children or other kin, or to friends. Meluntha and Blackfish, flanked by Blackhoof, Bluejacket, Chicksika, and Blacksnake, stood quietly together by the side of the Mishki and watched the loading of the pack horses. The French fur trader, Peter Laramie, shook hands with each and wished them well, promising he would return right after he had guided the great exodus to a new home across the Mississippi River. At the head of the migrating septs were the chiefs Black Stump, Red Eagle, Kikuskawalawa, Red Snake, and Yellow Hawk. They were made up of nearly 4,000 people, representing more than 2/3 of the Shawnee nation. Only the aged and infirm among them rode horses. The rest walked and used their horses to transport their goods. It would take them nearly a month to reach the new land, a grant of 25 square miles on Sugar Creek near Cape Girardeau in the Missouri country. Peter Laramie had negotiated with Spanish officials on behalf of the Shawnee and had been heard sympathetically by the Baron de Carondelet, who authorized the grant. And so now the assembled remaining chiefs watched in stony silence as the splitting of the Shawnee tribe became reality. Leaving the Ohio country forever to seek peace were the majority of the Kispakothas, the Pekawis, and the Thalagilas, along with the great number of the Chalagathas and many of the Makujays. Remaining to fight until the last man of them should die were for the most part just the broken remains of those final 2 septs. Among those who had elected to remain behind and fight the whites was Blacksnake, who had given up his leadership of the Kispakotha to Yellow Hawk in favor of remaining behind. He declared he would never make peace with the Shamanese, and his second-in-command Bluejacket had stood by him by the decision. The result of the cleavage meant the abandonment of many of the Shawnee towns, particularly those along the Scioto River. Chillicothe itself, which had boasted a population of almost 5,000, now retained only about 100 warriors. Blacksnake decided to join himself to the village under the leadership of Blackfish and Blackhoof. There were many of the Kispakotha remaining, however, who did not want to live with the Chalagatha, and now those turned to Bluejacket for leadership. Bluejacket announced that they would form their own town near the Makajay's principal village of Makachak, which was the village of his wife, Wabith. It was not a large village, and it was made up of a mixture of men and women from all 5 septs. It was located only a little way from the Makachak, and it was called Bluejacket's Town. This is the site of modern-day Bellefontaine, Ohio. Bellefontaine. Bluejacket was its chief. Because his own sept was now virtually gone, Bluejacket placed himself and his village under the authority of the old Shawnee he admired so much, Chief Meluntha, and the village became another Makajay town. The Shawnee had now, with this split, virtually abandoned eastern and central Ohio country, and the remaining villages were in the western portion of that territory. They were located on the Little Miami River, the Mad River, the Stillwater River, the Great Miami River, the Auglaize River, and the Maumee River. But they were pitiful remnants of what had once been a great and powerful nation. Small though they were in numbers now, the remaining Shawnee became ever more strongly welded together and more determined to fight to the death to protect this land they loved so much against the oncoming wave of white settlers. The war that had begun was far from over, and it was their determination to show the whites that one Shawnee warrior was equal to any 10 white men anywhere. It was a boast that would soon be put to the test. But though these remaining Shawnee felt more closely drawn to one another, there was a great sadness in their hearts. The split of the nation had left behind an emptiness and a loneliness, the like of which had been unknown in their entire history. For this, if for nothing else, Blue Jacket decided the white men would pay a dear price for the land they were now preparing to steal. Chapter 17. Friday, October 15th, 1779. Blackfish was dead. The entire remaining Shawnee Nation and the Ohio country were swept by an added sadness of the incident which took place from the most beloved chief they had ever had, and they swore swift vengeance. Of all those who were sad, few were more grief-stricken than the chief's wards, Chicksika and Tecumseh. Blue Jacket came at once to be with them. The death had been caused by a bullet wound, and it was a long and painful way to die. Less than 4 months after the split of the tribe, an army of 2,064 men, led by Colonel John Bowman, had crossed the Ohio River and routed north to attack Chillicothe. It was fortunate for the little army that this attack occurred after the Shawnee split. It was equally fortunate that at that time of Bowman's attack, considerably more than half of Chillicothe's remaining warriors were attending a tribal council at Wapatomica. Had the first been true, Bowman's army would have been wiped out to the last man. Had the second been true, he would have been met by 100 warriors instead of a total fighting force of 35 men and boys. He was fortunate in these matters because even though his army outnumbered the defenders nearly 8-1, he suffered an awful loss thanks to his inept leadership. Because of carelessness, he lost the element of surprise, and then as they began to fight through the town, his men were overtaken by greed and began to pay more attention to looting the wiggiwas of kettles, blankets, furs, and silver ornaments than to fighting. As a result, by the time 40 of the wiggiwas were burning, the Shawnee defenders, holed up in one strong wiggiwa, had killed 10 of Bowman's men with rifle fire, yet not a single Indian had even been injured. Strangely, with the enemy in the palm of his hands, Bowman suddenly lost his courage and ordered a retreat. Overjoyed, the warriors managed to round up 24 of their horses, which the whites had been unable to catch and take with them. They set out in pursuit, caught up to the army, and began to take shots at them from the rear. One by one, they cut down men more interested in carrying away their plunder than in returning the fire. The result was that more than 30 whites were killed before Captain James Harrod and 2 of his lieutenants, acting on their own, took command away from Bowman and ordered 100 men to throw down their loot and attack the small party shooting at them. Rushed upon in this manner, the 24 warriors scattered and abandoned the harassment and returned to Chillicothe. They got there at about the time the rest of the town's warriors returned from Wapatomica to find their houses burned and their possessions gone. There had also been tragedy which resulted from the Indians' pursuit of the whites. Their third sub-chief, Redpole, was dead. Blackfish lay in the wiggiwa in great pain from a severe bullet wound. The ball had shattered his hip socket, shooting splinters of bone into the surrounding flesh. In the chief's eyes were the sure knowledge of death, but there was also pride in his warriors for the way they had stood off the larger force. But the pride was soon replaced with great and growing pain. For 3 months he lingered, little by little, slipping towards the brink, and finally, just before the dawn 3 days ago, Blackfish had died. The news had spread at once to all the Shawnee, and from near and far they had come to witness the laying away of their great chief. For Blue Jacket and many of the others who came, it was the first they had seen of Chillicothe since Bowman's attack. Though the village had been rebuilt, it was only a shell of the great Shawnee center had once been, and they were shocked and angry. Instead of 1,000 or more wiggiwas, there were only a few hundred, and the ugly mounds of ash, those which had been burned, still bore mute testimony to the attack by the Shawnees. Inside the Miski, Blackfish was stretched out on his back on a sort of low table. He had been washed and shaved, and was now wrapped only in a fine new blanket. On the edge of the table and on the earth beneath and around him there was a great collection of goods brought by the tribesmen, mostly belts and calicos and ribbons. Beside his body lay his 4 most prized possessions in life, his rifle, tomahawk, knife, and pipe. A great number of Indians were present, and all of them wore loose clothing, and their hair was unbraided. Many of the warriors had painted their faces in whorls of yellow and blue and vermilion. The men were smoking. As they entered the huge room, they looked first upon the corpse of him who had been their leader, their old and beloved chief, their counselor in peace and in war. Then they sat in silence on the floor wherever there was room. No one spoke, and for hours they sat thus. Not a person present was without tears of grief in his eyes. At last, towards evening, Chicksika and 7 other warriors entered and gently slid 4 wide rawhide straps under the body. Each of the men gripped one and end of the strap, and together they lifted the body and carried it directly from the room to the burial ground 2 miles southwest of the town. No small child was allowed to accompany the funeral procession, lest he make some noise or cry during the solemn rite. Immediately following the body walked the 3 daughters and 2 sons of Blackfish and the family of Puck and Wah, his charges. Behind them came the new principal chief of the Shawnee, Blackhoof, and behind him came Meluntha, Blackbeard, Blacksnake, and all the other chiefs and sub-chiefs according to rank. Walking beside Blacksnake was Blue Jacket. Finally, some distance behind the chiefs came warriors of Chillicothe, then those of the other Shawnee villages, all of whom were followed by their squaws. Behind the squaws were the children between the ages of 8 and 15. The grave was already dug. It was a long, narrow rectangle, 2 feet across, 7 feet long, and 3.5 feet deep. At the bottom lay a screening or puncheon of split and tied branches. Similar puncheons were laid on edges along the 2 side walls of the grave. With care, Blackfish's body was lowered until it lay on its back at the bottom puncheon. Then the last clothing he had worn in health was placed atop his body. His old moccasins were cut into strips and placed with the other clothing. No weapon, food, or other memento was put into the grave. A final puncheon was then placed over the chief, and the effect was something of a rectangular open-ended box with which the chief lay. Then Blackhoof stepped to the head of the grave and removed a cloth bundle from his belt. From the throats of 1,000 or more mourners now came the eerie rising and falling notes of the death chant, a throbbing, melancholy sound filled with tenderness and regret and deep despair. Blackhoof opened the little bag and dipped his fingers into it and then sprinkled some coarsely ground material from it into the grave. This was Nilu Famo, sacred tobacco, a final sacrament. Slowly around the grave, Blackhoof moved as the chant continued, sprinkling more of the grains at each step into the platform below. When the bag was empty and he was back where he had begun, he dropped the empty bag into the center of the top puncheon. Then he turned and headed directly back to the Miski Miski, still chanting. All but 2 men followed. Chick-Stick and Blue Jacket were the 2 who remained behind, and only when the chant had become a faint sound in the distance did they set about scooping up the dirt and in their cupped hands to fill the hole. It took them about half an hour to finish, and then a smooth stone the size of a small pumpkin was placed at the foot of the grave, and the pair, still without speaking, left the place and went straight to the Little Miami River. Here they stripped themselves and threw away their clothing. They entered the river and scrubbed down their bodies with handfuls of sand. Then each man thrust his fingers down his throat and forced himself to vomit. They moved upstream a short distance, drank until they could drink no more, and once again forced themselves to vomit, thereby cleansing their bodies both inside and out. A short distance upstream on shore they found and put on the fresh loincloths awaiting them, and then jogged side by side back to the village of Chillicothe. When they entered the crowded Miski Miski, quiet discussion was being held. Each person who cared to was contributed some special little memory of his own personal contact with the great chief. Outside, squaws were roasting a large quantity of game. As it was finished, it was brought in and distributed to everybody present. In this way, the ceremony continued far into the night. Not until the first gray shafts of dawn streaked the eastern sky did it end. Blackfish had been greatly loved by his people. His death would be avenged. Chapter 18. Saturday, October 30th, 1779. It was Blacksnake and Blue Jacket who jointly led the Shawnee in the first blow struck to avenge the death of their chief. It was a harsh blow, too. While they were still at Chillicothe, runners brought news of a fleet of canoes moving downstream on the Spele-Wathipi. At once, an ambush was planned. Though the Indians could not know it, this was the party of one William Rogers, who fancied himself an empire builder. At Fort Randolph, he and his men had been warned against traveling further downriver, and had been told that of late an alarming number of attacks had been made on canoes by the Shawnee. Rogers almost laughed. What party of Shawnee would be foolhardy enough to attack 15 canoes carrying 75 picked men armed with the newest and best rifles available? Why, if it came right down to it, Rogers wouldn't be afraid to lead his very party of men on a direct invasion of the Shawnee strongholds. Fort Randolph's commander, he said, could better save his warnings and sympathy for any party of Indians they did meet. An extremely self-confident man, Rogers had labored long to build this large force. He planned to float directly to the mouth of the Ohio River, and there on the rich bottomlands where the river met the Mississippi, to establish almost overnight a settlement so well fortified that for the Indians to attack it would be suicide. The settlement would in time become a great western port city to be known as Rogers, or so at any rate was Rogers' belief. As he anticipated, the flotilla skimmed past the so-called most dangerous areas of 3 islands and the mouth of the Scioto River without seeing more than a handful of Shawnee. This is right next to present-day Manchester, Ohio. At the mouth of the Scioto River is the city of Portsmouth, Ohio. These had fled in apparent panic when well-armed rifle bullets had buzzed their way. The party put ashore on the lowermost of the 3 islands, in fact, had camped here for 2 days as a sort of resting place before starting the second lap of the journey to the wide Mississippi. Precautions were taken, and guards posted in the event an attack should occur, but as Rogers had predicted, no attack came. Now, far ahead, where the Licking River joined the Ohio, Rogers saw movement and quickly motioned his boatmen to put in on the Kentucky shore. Once on land, he crept ahead a short distance to observe from cover. There, on a sandbar far out in the river, stood several Indians. One was Blue Jacket. Even as Rogers watched, a canoe paddled up. 3 other Indians set off from the Kentucky shore to pick them up. 4 more Shawnee squatted on the river's south bank, waiting. They appeared very innocently concerned with themselves and wholly unaware of Rogers' approach. Rogers licked his lips and grinned. Only 10 Indians. What an opportunity to slow the savages that his was not a force to be tampered with. Immediately, Rogers ordered his boat made fast to shore and led all but a small guard detail in a wide sweep along the woods to encircle the savages. Apparently no one in the party was at all suspicious about the occasional bob-white quail, which whistled cheerily back and forth. When Rogers' line had taken position, hidden from the view of the 4 Indians on shore, the canoe, which had pecked almost 3 off the sandbar, was now almost back to the Kentucky shore. Rogers held up his hand to signal a rush upon them, but the signal was never given. There was a roar as several hundred Indians leapt from hiding in a semicircle around the whites. A tremendous barrage of shots shattered the air, and even as Rogers and the majority of his men fell, the Shawnee land party, led by Blacksnake, dropped their rifles and fell upon the survivors with tomahawks and war clubs. The ambush had been perfect. Except for the small handful of men guarding their canoe who fled through the woods at the firing, the entire party was wiped out. Rarely had so many fine scalps been taken in one fell swoop. Thus, in part, was the death of Chief Blackfish avenged. Chapter 19, Saturday, November 9th, 1782. The 3 years following the death of Blackfish were vicious ones along the Ohio River and in the Kentucky settlements. Along the dozens and scores of settlers coming down the Ohio River, they had increased to hundreds, even thousands. A good percentage were paying for it with their lives. The Shawnee had no doubt now that their Kentucky lands were lost to them forever. Dozens of small settlements had sprung up, and the larger ones, such as Harrodsburg, Stanford, Lexington, and Danville, had now become substantial towns. In June of 1780, Captain Henry Byrd had come down from Detroit to lead this 100 redcoats, 70 green-coated Canadian Rangers, and 1,100 Indians against the settlement south of the Ohio River. For once, the Indians had banded together for such a fight, and the work was not at all left up to the Shawnee alone. There were Delaware in this force, along with Potawatomis, Miamis, Wyandots, and even some Ottawa and Mingo. They had thrust deeply into Kentucky and destroyed Ruddle's and Martin's stations, killing many settlers and escaping with a large amount of plunder. But in the retaliation which followed almost immediately, it was the Shawnee who paid the worst price, since the villages were closest to the whites. In August that year, George Rogers Clark led an army of 1,000 Kentuckians and destroyed Chillicothe for the second time, and even went as far north as the village called Piqua on the banks of the Mad River. This is near Springfield, Ohio. It's now the site of George Rogers Clark State Park. Here he met the Shawnee. Since the first battle at Point Pleasant, Blue Jacket had stood out as one of the fiercest fighters on either side. His fame among the Indians, even those of the other tribes, grew even greater. But in this battle with Clark, the Indians were badly outnumbered and outweaponed. Faulty flintlocks and simple tomahawks could do little against a superior force armed with new rifles and even artillery pieces. Before these canoes, the Shawnee had been forced to flee. Both Chillicothe and Piqua were utterly destroyed, and their surrounding cornfields were burned. The whites had lost 14 killed and 13 wounded, but the Shawnee suffered losses 3 times this great. The result was an extremely hard winter for the Shawnee, with food scarce and starvation a constant threat. To make up for their lack in food and clothing, they increased their attacks, mainly led by Blue Jacket against the white boat traffic on the Spalewathepe. Dozens, scores, hundreds of boats were taken, their cargo confiscated, their passengers slain. Without the goods these boats provided, along with a certain amount of British help, the Shawnee would not have made it through the winter. When warmer weather came, the attacks fell off, and the Shawnee returned to the sites of Chillicothe and Piqua to rebuild their homes and replant their fields. Even though in October the Revolutionary War ended between the British and the Americans in the East, here on the western frontier the friction continued, encouraged by the British at Detroit. Again they sent a commander, Captain William Caldwell, to lead the Indians on another attack against the Kentucky settlements, and in this one they had great success. First they took and destroyed Bryant Station, but while the battle was in progress, some men who escaped carried word to Harrodsburg, and a force of Kentuckians were quickly mounted to pursue the attack. Aware that they were being chased, the Shawnee led the whites into a severe ambush at the Blue Licks. So successful was it that while hardly an Indian was killed or wounded, a total of 70 whites were killed. That number included some of the best officers then in Kentucky, such as Colonel Stephen Trigg and John Todd. Boone's son Israel was killed, and Daniel himself was wounded. It was a distinct victory for the Shawnee, but once again it led to an invasion by the army of George Rogers Clark. The army crossed the river and headed north towards Chillicothe. When an easy ride away, they stopped for the night to prepare for the forthcoming battle. Clark wrote out his final battle orders for the morrow and posted them on a tree at the edge of the camp. At first there was a good-sized crowd around the orders, but it gradually dwindled. At twilight, only 3 men stood in front of it. The man in the middle read it loudly, slowly, and laboriously. All 3 were dressed in similarly worn leathers, linsey-woolsey, and moccasins. Each had a knife at his belt, and one wore a tomahawk at his waist. All 3 wore fur hats made of raccoon skin. The orders called for the men to pay the strictest attention to their duty the next day. Any prisoners taken were to be kept alive for questioning and possible later exchange for white prisoners. No soldier was to take any plunder for himself, but was to deliver to the quartermaster, where after the battle it would then be divided. When the one who had been reading aloud was finished, he spat a brown stream of tobacco juice to the ground and then grunted disgustedly. "Clark's sure taking all the fun out of things, ain't he? Best part of going on these expeditions is killing Injuns and taking all you can get from 'em. First come, first serve, ain't that right, boys?" The man to his left grunted in affirmative, but the tall fellow on the left continued to stare silently at the general orders. The reader squinted at him and spoke again. "Don't recollect ever I seen you before. You new to Kentuck?" The tall man nodded. "Got here just in time to come along. Came from my folks' place along the Cherry River, south and east of the Kanawha. That right? Me and Jabo here, we're from Pittsburgh, never been around this way. What's your name?" The tall man shrugged. "Just call me Duke. Well, I'm going to eat now." He turned and sauntered off into the growing darkness. Jabo looked at his companion and grinned. "Them Virginia men talk funny, don't they, Mike?" Mike nodded and spat again. "Yeah, and they ain't too friendly neither. Lest you and me go eat too, Jabo." 50 yards away, the man who had identified himself as Duke slipped through the undergrowth and silently crossed a creek and water just over his knees. On the other side, he broke into a quiet run, which continued until he reached a little clearing a quarter-mile away. There he ripped off the fur cap and shook his long black hair free and literally tore the linsey shirt from his back. He untied the horse waiting for him there and threaded his way through the dark woods for more than a mile before finally breaking into open prairie country and putting his horse to a canter. Blue Jacket curled his lips. The very fact that he had spoken English left a bad taste in his mouth. He had been surprised at how difficult it had been for him to read Clark's orders. How many years now had it been since he had tried to read English? Not enough, he decided. In a few hours he reached Chillicothe and spread the news. The Chamonix under Clark were coming again, and again there was not enough warriors here to face them. Retreat was the only answer, both from here and from Piqua. He would warn the others at Molunthus Town and Mackachak, in his town, at Girty's Town, in Upper and Lower Piqua Towns, and in Solomon's Town. The Shawnee, all of them, would gather at Wapatomika Town, and there, with proper strength and weapons, then meet the enemy. As Blue Jacket rode off, a 14-year-old boy moved into the shadows behind his wigwam and clasped the piece of quartzite tied to a rawhide thong around his neck. It felt warm to his hand. "Munito," he whispered, "I call on you through this Pawaka to help us. Let us escape without harm to our wigwams, which can be built up again. Spare our elders and our women and children, and keep our warriors strong. Let not the Chamonix destroy them, and most of all, Munito, spare my brother Chiksika and my sister Tecumseh, and spare the members of our family. Guide and protect our battle leaders, Black Snake and Blue Jacket. I, Tecumseh, ask this of you through this Pawaka which I earned here." Then he went to where the others were packing to help him. Chapter 20. Saturday, April 30th, 1785. Clark's expedition had been victorious, but it was a shallow victory at best. All the Shawnee town they had marched upon, Chillicothe, Piqua, Upper and Lower Pequot towns had been found deserted with the real plunder left behind and no one to oppose them. With little real plunder left behind and no one to oppose them. These towns were destroyed, the crops burned, and the army marched home again, satisfied that this time the destruction had been so complete that the towns would never be built up again. The truth of the matter was that they had hardly returned to Kentucky before new wigwams were being erected again over the ashes of the old. And now, once again, the attacks against boat traffic on the Spalywithipi increased. The Shawnee persisted in their belief that they would be able to hold the white country against the whites, but it was a belief rapidly dying. Already white settlements were forming in the southeastern Ohio country along the river, and now word had come through the British that Virginia was giving its soldiers bounty lands in the Ohio country as reward for having fought well in the American Revolution. Connecticut, too, was claiming a vast section of the Ohio country, bordering Lake Erie, and calling it Western Reserve. Settlers would soon be flocking in there as well. To fight back against this encroachment and to continue to harass the whites at every turn, the Shawnee now looked even more to one man, Blue Jacket. This incredible chief seemed to lead a charmed life, and his forays into the Kentucky country or against boats descending the river always seemed to meet with great success. Although Blacksnake was still holding the title of War Chief of the Shawnee, he was becoming old and slow and a little bit too cautious. In fact, it was Blue Jacket who was filling the post now. On this morning at their wigwam in Blue Jacket's town, Blue Jacket and Wilbeath lay side by side in their low bed and watched the first rays of sunlight begin to lighten the dim interior. Wilbeath had awakened before dawn and was weeping when Blue Jacket awoke. Concerned, he had held her close to him and brought out the reason with a little coaxing. "There is within me, my husband, no new little life which is a part of you. Not for a long time has this been true, and I fear I can bear you no more children." Her eyes were deep with longing. Blue Jacket grinned, showing strong white teeth, and held her even closer. "Although it has been 4 years since the last one, my little swan," he said slowly and softly, "do not think I will discard you because of it. No, I would keep you even should your hair become white and all your teeth fall away. What warrior would not keep such a woman as you? You have given me a son and 2 daughters. You are a part of my life, and you always will be." He leaned over and pressed his lips to her eyes, and in turn rose into her nose, and she pushed him gently back and shook her head. "You must get ready to leave now," she said. "The sun is up, and you must not be late for the Grand Council meeting." Nodding reluctantly, Blue Jacket stood up and stepped into his leggings and pulled them over his feet in fine moccasins she had made for him. He was an impressive figure of a man. At 31 years of age, he was still smoothly muscled and without an ounce of fat on his 6-foot frame. His handsome face, framed by shoulder-length blue-black hair, was graven with lines of character befitting one of 50 years. There could be no doubt that he was wise and strong in the prime of his life. Carelessly, but with smooth grace, he ducked into his soft doeskin pullover blouse and tugged it down over his broad chest. He drew his belt around him and thrust the pipe tomahawk into it, then scooped up his rifle from where it leaned against the wall. Automatically, he checked the powder for dampness, as he always did upon rising. He tossed horn and pouch slings over his shoulders, and then stooped for a moment beside the bed where Wilbeath lay, watching him proudly. He smiled and ran his hand gently through her hair, then touched his lips to his forehead. "Go back to sleep, Swan," he said. "It's early yet." Then he was gone. The sun was nearly straight up when he arrived at the massive Miski in Wapatumika town. The sight of the huge building, as always, filled him with pleasure. Since the destruction of Chillicothe's big council house, this was the largest structure in the Shawnee Nation. Over the years, how many wonderful and tragic things had he bare witness to inside the heart of the Shawnee Nation. But what was the reason that Malunta and Katahekasa had called this council? There were many more horses picketed than he had anticipated, and his heart beat a little faster as he crossed into the door. Had another army been discovered crossing the river to march on them? The room was well filled with warriors of the Chalagatha and Makajay steppes, but here and there were the few remaining representatives of the Kispakotha, the Pekawee, and Thalagila steppes. Chiksika and his young brother Tecumseh were there, as was the ugly old war chief he liked so well, Blacksnake. In the center of the room by themselves sat the 2 most important chiefs of the Shawnee tribe, Blackhoof and Malunta. Throughout the huge room were most of the other chiefs and sub-chiefs of the various villages. Whatever the nature of this council, it was tribally important. Blue Jacket took his place with a large group of warriors from his own town and filled his pipe. Others had already done so, and a pleasant haze of blue-white smoke fogged the room as all present sat and puffed quietly. As the pipes were finished, Their owners placed them in their laps or on the ground beside them. At last, when all the pipes had been smoked out and laid aside, Black Cuff arose, and the faint murmur of voices stilled instantly. "My children," he said, "we are come here for a most important matter. What will take place here today has never happened before, and I believe will not happen again. It is a time of sadness and a time of rejoicing that I would ask our ancient king to tell you of it." He reached down and took Molunta's bony hand and gently helped him rise, then sat down himself. Molunta slowly let his gaze sweep back and forth across the assemblage twice before speaking. He was becoming frail these days, and his long hair was pure white, his eyes nearly hidden in the deeply wrinkled face. Yet his voice when he spoke was still rich and strong and did not crack. "My children, what Kara Hekasa has told you is true. This is a day both of sadness and rejoicing, but the rejoicing is the greater of the two, and the sadness only aids in enriching the joy. I have seen 100 summers. I am old, and I grow weak. My eyes can no longer follow the flight of the pigeon, nor my legs the trail of the deer. It is time for me to step aside as chief of the Meikujay Sept, and because of this, there must be sadness in my heart and in yours. It is my right, not only as descending chief, but as eldest of all the Shawnee, to select the warrior who will be taking my place. He must be the bravest of the brave, the boldest of the bold, but he must be more than this. He must know when to fight and when to withdraw. He must be able and willing to think first of his people, and if necessary, to lay down his life for them. He must be proven in battle and in leadership, and he must have the respect and admiration of all his fellow tribesmen. He must be wise and able to use his wisdom without pride, cruel if circumstances demanded, but not make cruelty his master or his pleasure. Kind, but not let kindness become weakness. The man I have chosen has all these abilities and more. Only the principal chief could overrule this decision of mine, and Kara Hekasa has already told you he approves of my choice. From this moment forward, the chief of the Meikujay Shawnee is the man to whom I now appoint." He extended a bony arm. "He whose name is Weyapiresiwa." At the heart of Blue Jacket, the white man turned Shawnee nearly burst inside him with pride. Chapter 21. Tuesday, January 3rd, 1786. The small party of Shawnee, led by Chief Blue Jacket, showed remarkable restraint in masking their anger and disgust at the terms of the treaty that were now being asked to sign at this new little fort. The fort was located in the Ohio country, just a short distance of the great Miami River from its mouth. Its very presence here was an affront to the Indians, and some of the statements in the treaty were almost laughable, they were so contradictory. Yet both sides pretended ignorance of their existence, the whites because they believed they were deluding these ignorant savages, and the Indians because objection at this time could serve no purpose other than to endanger them. The Shawnee were painfully aware that, although the army colonel and his men treated them with forced respect, each man in the company, with the exception of the colonel, carried a rifle. The 20 Shawnee were outnumbered nearly 10 to 1, so now was not the time to show the anger and the scorn they felt at these treaty proposals. Colonel Richard Butler and his fellow commissioners, Captains Lewis and Zane, had arrived here several weeks ago, just as Fort Finney was nearing completion. The fort had been built on this bottom land, with nervous speed under direction of its commander, Major Fimney. The treaty being offered the Shawnee was simple and deceptive. Without ever mentioning the treaty held some time ago with the northern Indians, to which the Shawnee had not been invited, and to which this very Shawnee land was allegedly sold, it reaffirmed the Ohio River as the border between the Shawnee and the whites. The only exceptions were the two forts in their sites, Fort Hamar, already built on the mouth of the Muskingum River, and this fort. "The purpose of these forts," Colonel Butler said blandly, "is not one of invasion, but rather for your protection. They are meant to turn back any whites who might try to settle on the Ohio side of the river. The treaty proclaims an everlasting friendship with the Shawnee. It is good to know that the differences of opinion between our people can now at last be put aside for all time." The officers were surprised at the fluency with which Chief Blue Jacket spoke English, and even more amazed when, with a distinct flourish, he signed the treaty with his Shawnee name, Weyapiresiwa, and added in parentheses Chief Blue Jacket. Colonel Butler looked at the double signature and then turned to Blue Jacket. He was obviously very curious. "Who," he asked, "taught you to read and write so well, Chief?" Blue Jacket's answering smile was faint and cold. "My teachers were good," he said, "but I learned later to despise them." After leaving the fort, the Shawnee banner rode upstream nearly 20 miles before camping for the night. A light snow had commenced falling, and the chief sat close to the fire beside Chickseekit and Tecumseh. He spoke softly, but his voice was bitter. "I have never hated the whites as much as I hate them today," he said. "They were deceitful, treacherous, implacable enemies who should never be trusted in word or deed. They should be destroyed." He looked at the brothers and added, "They will be destroyed, not now, because our party is too small and the weather too bad, but in the green moon we will return here in force, kill all these soldiers, and burn this fort. Their presence here is an insult to our dignity and intelligence." Chapter 22, Sunday, April 9th, 1786. The garrison had collected its gear and moved out of Fort Finney just in time. Standing now on high ground to the west of the swollen river with the company outstretched behind them, Major Finney and his adjutant, Captain Ziegler, watched gloomily as the waters of the great Miami River inundated the fort bearing the major's name. The flood had come quickly, and now only the top of the blockhouse and the last 8 inches of the wall pickets still showed above the swirling yellow waters. With a disgusted grunt, Major Finney stood high in his stirrups and gave his men the command to march, leading them west towards the north side of the Ohio River, just opposite the young settlement of Louisville. Here, he planned to build a new fort, which would take the name of the abandoned one. But this one, he declared to Ziegler, would be built on high ground above flood level. No cruel hand of nature would destroy this one. Not one of the nearly 200 men in that column realized that the cruel hand of nature that had just destroyed the fort had also just saved their lives. At this very moment, less than 30 miles away, Chief Blue Jacket was leading a force of over 500 Shawnee to storm the fortification and wipe out its garrison.